This one didn't leak, it landed. No rumors, no whispers, no sources say. A court filing, a confirmation, a door officially closed. Kandi Burruss and Todd Tucker, once framed as unshakable, once defended against every doubt, are now legally done. And the moment that confirmation hit, the internet went silent before it erupted. Because this wasn't supposed to end like this. Not after the vows, not after the businesses, not after the years of defending their love against critics, family tension, and public pressure. And yet, here it is in black and white. The split finalized after Kandi herself filed, ending one of reality TV's most scrutinized marriages with no room left for, maybe they'll work it out. Fans are stunned, not because problems didn't exist, but because of how final this feels. No drawn-out courtroom circus. No messy public back and forth. Just a clean confirmation that something once fiercely protected has quietly collapsed. And now everyone is asking the same question. What finally broke that couldn't be fixed? Old scenes are being replayed with new meaning. Old warnings sound louder. Old defenses feel heavier. Suddenly, moments that once seemed small feel like cracks that were ignored for too long. And the timing. That's what has people spiraling. Because this didn't come after chaos, it came after silence. Kandi hasn't said much. Todd hasn't either. And that quiet is doing more damage than any argument ever could. Because when a marriage this public ends this decisively, people know one thing for sure: whatever happened behind closed doors was big enough that love, loyalty, and legacy couldn't hold it together anymore. The confirmation didn't come with theatrics. No explosive interview, no emotional live stream, no dramatic caption. It came through the coldest source possible, the court, and that's exactly why it hit so hard. Because when paperwork confirms what speculation couldn't, there's no room left for denial. Kandi Burruss and Todd Tucker's marriage is officially over, finalized after Kandi herself filed, and the finality of that detail is what stopped fans in their tracks. For years, this relationship was framed as resilient. Tested, yes, but resilient. Viewers watched them fight through family opposition, business entanglements, fertility struggles, and the unique pressure of being married under a microscope. Every obstacle was met with the same response: they'll work it out. Until suddenly, they didn't. What made this moment especially jarring is how quiet it was. No long, messy legal war playing out in public. No leaked audio. No shady posts. Just a clean confirmation that the marriage had reached a point of no return. That silence felt deliberate and heavy. Because couples who go through hell publicly don't usually end things this quietly unless the decision was firm, considered, and emotionally final long before the court ever got involved. Fans immediately began revisiting the timeline. Not just the fights, but the fatigue. The moments when Kandi looked worn down instead of angry. The times Todd seemed defensive rather than connected. The scenes where compromise felt forced instead of mutual. What once looked like normal marital tension now reads like the slow erosion of something that had been holding on out of obligation more than alignment. And the fact that Kandi filed changed the entire tone of the conversation. This wasn't a mutual, we grew apart statement. This was a decision, a choice, one that suggests clarity, not confusion. For a woman known for perseverance, loyalty, and endurance, filing for divorce isn't impulsive, it's the result of exhaustion meeting certainty. Social media reactions reflected that shift immediately. Fans weren't celebrating. They weren't gossiping wildly. They were processing. Many expressed sadness not because they idolized the marriage, but because they recognized how hard Kandi fought to make it work. She defended Todd publicly. She pushed back against her own family. She absorbed criticism to protect their union. So for her to be the one to file told people something important had changed. People also couldn't ignore the timing. The divorce wasn't finalized in the heat of a scandal. It came after a long stretch of quiet. No recent blow-ups. No viral fights. Which made it feel less like a reaction and more like a conclusion, something that had already been decided emotionally long before it became legal. That realization led fans to re-examine the narrative around Todd. Not as a villain, but as a factor in a dynamic that may have become unsustainable. Over the years, critics questioned power balance, financial blending, and influence. Supporters defended him as a partner who stood by Kandi and helped expand her empire. The truth likely lived somewhere in between. But now, with the marriage officially over, those unresolved questions feel heavier, not because they prove anything, but because they never got resolved. Mama Joyce's past warnings resurfaced almost instantly, not as vindication, but as context. Fans debated whether those concerns were prophetic or simply hindsight gaining power after the fact. But even those who dislike Mama Joyce admitted something uncomfortable. When a marriage ends this definitively, people naturally look backward for meaning. And meaning is hard to avoid when so many past conflicts pointed to the same stress points: money, influence, boundaries, and loyalty. What stood out most in this phase wasn't drama, it was restraint. Kandi didn't rush to explain herself. Todd didn't rush to defend himself. That mutual silence suggested something rare in public divorces: acceptance. Not peace, acceptance. The kind that comes when arguing no longer feels productive and walking away feels like the only honest option left. Fans also reflected on how much of their marriage was spent navigating outside pressure. Cameras, opinions, family involvement, business overlap. Very few relationships can survive that without cracks forming. And while viewers often assign blame to one person, this moment reminded people that sometimes the damage comes from the environment itself, not a single act, but years of strain that slowly drain connection. Another detail that hit hard was the lack of celebration or relief in fan spaces. No good riddance. No finally, just disappointment. Because people didn't see this as a toxic relationship ending, they saw it as a worked-on relationship that still failed. And that's harder to accept. It forces people to admit that effort doesn't always equal success, and love doesn't always guarantee longevity. This first section of the story doesn't offer insider revelations or scandalous twists. It offers something more sobering: the reality that some marriages don't end with explosions. They end with paperwork, quiet resolve, and two people choosing not to keep bleeding in public. As this chapter closes, one truth feels unavoidable. Whatever finally pushed Kandi Burruss to file wasn't small, it wasn't impulsive, and it wasn't something love alone could fix anymore. Because when a woman known for endurance decides to stop enduring, that decision tells its own story, even when she chooses not to say a word. As the reality of the finalized divorce settled in, the conversation entered its second phase, and this is where the emotional weight truly sank in. The shock gave way to reassessment, not of one argument or one season of footage, but of an entire marriage that had been lived publicly for years, while its most critical fractures quietly deepened behind the scenes. People stopped asking what happened and started asking how long it had been happening. Because once the court confirmed the split, fans realized something sobering. This wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. A slow buildup of unresolved tension, unmet expectations, and emotional fatigue that no amount of public unity could hide forever. And when you rewatch the story with that lens, the signs don't jump out loudly, they whisper. Viewers began talking about the subtle shifts. The way conversations between Kandi and Todd started sounding more transactional than intimate. The way business discussions overtook personal ones. The moments where compromise felt more like concession. Over time, it became harder to tell where marriage ended and partnership began, and that blur may have been the very thing that wore them down. One of the biggest themes people kept circling back to was power imbalance, not in a dramatic or malicious way, but in a structural one. Kandi Burruss is a powerhouse. Her success, her wealth, her influence, and her responsibilities extend far beyond a typical marriage. Todd entered that world not as a passive observer, but as a collaborator. And collaboration, while powerful, can also strain intimacy when roles become undefined. Fans began asking whether their marriage ever got the chance to just be a marriage, or whether it was always expected to function like a joint venture under constant scrutiny. When love becomes layered with contracts, decisions, staff, and stakes, even the strongest bonds can fray. And people started wondering whether Kandi reached a point where the emotional cost of that entanglement outweighed the benefits of staying. Todd's role during this phase of the conversation was dissected carefully. Not accused, dissected. Supporters emphasized his contributions, loyalty, and visible commitment over the years. Critics questioned whether he fully understood the weight of the world he stepped into, or whether proximity to power created tensions that never truly resolved. The discussion wasn't about blame, it was about compatibility over time. Another uncomfortable realization emerged. Defending a relationship for years can delay the moment you admit it's not working. Kandi spent a long time protecting her marriage publicly, against critics, against family, against fans who doubted its foundation. And sometimes, that level of defense becomes a trap, because admitting the relationship has run its course can feel like admitting the critics were right, even when the truth is more nuanced. This phase also forced people to reconsider Mama Joyce's long-standing opposition, not as a victory lap, but as a factor in ongoing stress. Living in a marriage where family tension never fully dissipates is exhausting. Even if a couple is solid, constant friction can erode peace over time. And for Kandi, being caught between her mother and her husband may have created emotional labor that never stopped, even when cameras weren't rolling. What stood out in this phase was the absence of bitterness. There were no public attacks, no messy accusations, no attempt to sway public opinion. That lack of hostility made the divorce feel less like a breakdown and more like a decision rooted in self-preservation. Sometimes, the end of a marriage doesn't come from rage, it comes from clarity. Fans also noticed how Kandi's recent public demeanor had changed long before the filing. She appeared more focused inward, more protective of her peace, less willing to explain herself. Those shifts now read as someone preparing emotionally for a major transition, not reacting to one. The discussion also turned toward legacy. Kandi has built a life that will long outlast this marriage. And for someone that accomplished, staying in a relationship that no longer aligns can feel like a contradiction. People began suggesting that the divorce wasn't about failure, it was about alignment finally being acknowledged instead of forced. What made this phase particularly heavy was the realization that love doesn't always end. Sometimes it transforms into something unlivable. There may still be respect, history, shared experiences. But when the structure collapses, emotion alone can't hold it together. And the court's confirmation made that truth unavoidable. As the second chapter of this story closed, fans weren't left angry, they were reflective. About how marriages evolve, about how public pressure distorts private decisions, and about how strength sometimes looks like knowing when to stop trying to fix something that's already changed. Because by this point, one thing felt clear. This divorce wasn't the result of one dramatic moment. It was the outcome of years of quiet compromise, finally meeting a boundary that couldn't be crossed anymore. And once that boundary is reached, even the strongest love has to make room for something else. Survival, peace, and the courage to walk away without making a spectacle of the pain. By the time the conversation reached its third phase, the headlines had cooled, but the meaning of the divorce had not. What once felt like shocking news slowly settled into something heavier: understanding. Not agreement, not relief. Understanding, because once the court confirmed the split, people weren't just reacting to an ending. They were reckoning with what that ending represents when a marriage collapses quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. This phase wasn't about uncovering secrets. It was about accepting that not every breakup comes with villains or revelations. Some come with realization, and that can be harder to process than scandal. The most striking element at this point was finality. No ambiguity, no working through things, no room for interpretation. The legal confirmation stripped away hope that the marriage was merely going through a rough patch. It forced fans to confront a truth many avoid in their own lives. Sometimes relationships don't fail because of betrayal, they fail because they stop fitting the people inside them. People began reframing Kandi Burruss's decision, not as an admission of defeat, but as an act of self-trust. For someone who built her career on endurance, hustle, and resilience, choosing to walk away from a long-term marriage suggests something deeper than frustration. It suggests a moment where staying would have required shrinking, and leaving meant choosing wholeness over optics. This phase also brought renewed respect for how the divorce was handled. No public dragging, no social media warfare, no attempts to control the narrative. In an era where breakups are monetized and pain is packaged for clicks, that restraint spoke volumes. It suggested maturity, but also emotional exhaustion, the kind that doesn't need an audience to validate it. Fans began acknowledging something uncomfortable. Silence can be the loudest confirmation. The lack of public statements didn't feel evasive anymore, it felt intentional. As if both Kandi and Todd understood that explaining every detail wouldn't heal anything. That whatever happened belonged to them, not to public debate. And that choice, while frustrating for spectators, earned a measure of respect. Another realization emerged during this phase: not all marriages end in resentment. Some end in acceptance. And acceptance doesn't trend, it doesn't go viral, it doesn't satisfy curiosity. But it's often the most honest ending a relationship can have. People began seeing the divorce less as a collapse and more as a closing, one that had likely been emotionally processed long before it reached a courtroom. This also reframed Todd Tucker's role in the story. Without dramatic accusations or defenses, his presence remained complex but human. Not a villain, not a hero. Just a person who shared a long chapter of life that eventually reached its limit. And that framing mattered because it allowed space for multiple truths. He can have been supportive and still incompatible in the long run. Mama Joyce's past objections, which once dominated the conversation, began to fade into the background here. Not because they were irrelevant, but because they were no longer the point. The divorce didn't confirm her warnings or validate her behavior. It simply proved that family tension alone doesn't determine a marriage's fate. At most, it may have been part of a larger environment that made sustaining the relationship harder over time. This phase also pushed fans to reflect on how much pressure public marriages endure. Every disagreement becomes a storyline. Every compromise is judged. Every quiet moment is interpreted. That level of surveillance can distort decision-making, making it harder for couples to distinguish their own needs from audience expectation. In that context, walking away privately becomes an act of reclaiming autonomy. What lingered most strongly was empathy, for Kandi especially. Not pity. Empathy. People recognize the weight of being someone who makes it work for a living, someone who fixes, builds, negotiates, and perseveres. Choosing divorce in that context isn't failure, it's recognition that some problems aren't meant to be solved, only released. Fans also began relating the story to their own lives. The relationships they stayed in too long. The moments they defended something, because walking away felt like admitting loss. The realization that effort doesn't guarantee alignment. Those reflections gave the story depth beyond celebrity culture. It stopped being about Kandi and Todd and started being about how endings can be healthy, even when they're painful. This third phase didn't bring closure in the traditional sense. There were no final answers, no official explanations, no emotional speeches. But it brought something quieter and perhaps more meaningful, acceptance that some chapters end not with drama, but with dignity. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. This divorce wasn't meant to be consumed as entertainment. It was meant to be understood as a decision made after years of trying, compromising, and carrying weight that no longer felt sustainable. And maybe that's the most honest ending of all. Not loud, not messy, just final and necessary. Before you click away, take a breath, because this ending deserves more than a scroll and a shrug. What you just witnessed wasn't reality TV chaos or a headline designed to shock. It was a quiet confirmation of something many people live through, but rarely talk about. The moment you realize trying harder isn't the same as living better. If this story made you reflect, even for a second, don't ignore that. Like this video to support conversations that honor growth instead of glorifying breakdowns. Comment with your thoughts, not to assign blame, but to talk about endurance, boundaries, and the courage it takes to admit when something no longer fits, even after years of investment. And subscribe. Not because you want mess, but because you want context. Stories like this don't end at the court filing. They ripple. They change how people see love, loyalty, and self-preservation. And when more perspective emerges, you'll want coverage that respects complexity instead of chasing outrage. Missing this conversation means letting the loudest, simplest takes dominate the narrative. Staying engaged means choosing nuance over noise and empathy over spectacle. If you've ever stayed longer than you should have, defended something until you were exhausted, or learned that walking away can be an act of strength, this story isn't distant. It's familiar. Stay here. Be part of the conversation that treats endings with dignity, because not every closure needs chaos to be meaningful.